On a gray October morning in 1886, a crew of railroad graders working the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Gulf Line near the Arkansas-Oklahoma border made a discovery that would have been better left beneath the earth. They were blasting through a limestone outcropping known locally as Cinder Bluff, a name the Choctaw gave to the dark, fire-scarred rock that jutted above the timber. The foreman, a weathered Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, ordered his men to dig around a collapsed section where the grade had softened. They found what they first took for old bones, cattle, likely, lost in the winter of '84. But as they cleared the rubble, they realized the remains were human. Not one skeleton. At least 5. The men stood in silence, shovels hanging loose in their hands. A few crossed themselves. One of the younger graders vomited behind a cottonwood. The bodies had been arranged, not haphazardly, but laid in a rough circle, skulls turned inward as if in conference. The bones showed not the clean marks of a knife, these were blows from something heavier, a maul or sledge. And buried among them, cradled in the ribs of the largest skeleton, was a leather-bound journal, its pages fused together by damp and time. O'Malley sent word to Fort Smith, to the federal marshal's office. But by the time the law arrived, the railroad company had already made a decision: the grade would be adjusted, the bones would be removed, and the discovery would be kept from the newspapers. The railroad had investors in New York and London, and talk of unmarked graves on the right-of-way was bad for business. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the journal, whatever it contained, was not the only thing buried at Cinder Bluff. To understand what happened in that forgotten stretch of Choctaw Nation, you must first understand the world into which the victims were born and died. The year is 1873. The Civil War has been over for 8 years, but the wounds have not healed in the South, they are still seeping. In the Indian Territory, the wounds are older still. The 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had been forced west along the Trail of Tears decades before. By the 1870s, they had rebuilt their nations, with written constitutions, courts, and a society that mirrored the white South in many ways, including the institution of slavery. Black slaves had been brought to the territory alongside Choctaw and Chickasaw families, and after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Treaties of 1866 compelled the tribes to free their slaves and grant them citizenship. But citizenship and acceptance are not the same thing, and the freedmen of the territory found themselves caught between worlds, not fully Indian, not fully free, and viewed with suspicion by white settlers pouring in from the east. Into this volatile world came a man whose name would soon be forgotten, except in the pages of a water-stained journal. His name was Elijah Briggs. He was a schoolteacher from Ohio, a graduate of Oberlin College, where he had been radicalized by the abolitionist teachings of Charles Finney. Briggs was not a soldier, not a frontiersman, he was a thin, bespectacled man of 42 who believed in the power of education to heal the wounds of the nation. In the winter of 1872, he accepted a position with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to establish a school for the children of freedmen in the Choctaw Nation. The BIA had been expanding its presence in the territory since the end of the war, building schools, negotiating treaties, and trying to impose order on a land where jurisdiction was murky at best. The federal courts had jurisdiction over major crimes involving non-Indians, but tribal courts handled most matters. The marshals from Fort Smith, the famous hanging Judge Isaac Parker's court, were stretched thin across a territory larger than many states. Briggs arrived in the town of Scullyville, an old Choctaw settlement that had once been the capital of the nation and had fallen into decline. The school he was to lead was a modest wooden building, paid for by the Bureau and staffed by a freedwoman named Elizabeth Davis, who had been born into slavery in Mississippi and had walked the Trail of Tears as a child. From his first days, Briggs began to document the world around him in his journal. He wrote not just of his students, their names, their parents, their aspirations, but of the broader landscape, the politics, the tensions that simmered beneath the surface. He recorded the names of the families who had come to the territory seeking land, and the families who had been there for generations, and the families who had no paper at all. The journal's first entry, dated March 14, 1873, is filled with the optimism of a man who still believes in progress. Arrived at the agency today. The journey from Fort Smith was hard, but the country is beautiful in a wild way. The trees are just beginning to bud. Mr. Harrison, the agent, has received me kindly. The freedmen are eager to learn. I have already met several families. They speak of their children as if they are the hope of a new age. I confess I have never seen such faith, not even at Oberlin. The Choctaw are a proud people, but they are not warm to me. I suspect they view me as another representative of the government that has broken so many promises. But by June, the tone of the journal has shifted. There is a name that appears again and again, a man named Solomon Cross. Cross is a white man, a former Confederate cavalry scout who has settled in the area and taken up claim to land that the Choctaw and their freedmen have occupied for years. Cross is a bitter man, a man who lost a brother at Pea Ridge and has never forgiven the federal government or the Indians they protected. Cross came to the school today to demand that the children be taught proper American history, which he seems to think consists solely of battles won by white men. I told him that I teach what is true, and he grew very angry. He said the government has no right to spend money on colored children when it will not support the children of true Americans. He spoke of the law, of land claims, of petitions he has filed in Fort Smith. I suspect he is looking for an excuse to have the school closed. What Briggs did not yet understand was that Solomon Cross was not merely a disgruntled settler. He was connected to a network of men who saw the Indian Territory not as a sovereign nation, but as land to be taken. And he had allies in places that would surprise the idealistic teacher from Ohio. The second body at Cinder Bluff was identified by a locket found near the pelvis, a tarnished silver oval, stamped with the initials SD. Inside was a photograph, barely legible, of a woman with dark hair and a determined expression. Her name, the journal would eventually reveal, was Sarah Dalton, a freedwoman who served as a translator for the school, fluent in Choctaw and English, a woman who had been born in the territory but whose parents had walked from Mississippi. Sarah was 33 years old when she died. She had been a midwife, a translator, and a quiet but persistent advocate for the freedmen's community. The journal contains dozens of references to her work cataloging births and deaths, mediating disputes, helping the elderly navigate the bureaucracy of the BIA. But it also contains references to a secret that Sarah Dalton had uncovered. In the late summer of 1873, a group of men from Texas arrived in Scullyville. They called themselves cattle buyers, but Sarah recognized one of them, a man she had seen years before, when she was still enslaved on a plantation in Mississippi. That man, whose name she would not record for fear of reprisal, had been an overseer, a cruel one, who had been driven from the state after the war for crimes that were never prosecuted. The overseer was traveling under a different name now. But Sarah recognized his scarred hands, his distinctive limp, the way he spoke to the local authorities with an air of authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his present station. And when she overheard him speaking to Solomon Cross one evening outside the school, she realized she had stumbled upon something more dangerous than a fugitive from justice. The journal entry for September 19, 1873, is difficult to read. The paper has been water damaged, and Briggs's handwriting grows more agitated as the entry continues. Sarah came to me tonight after the children were put to bed. She was shaking, though it was not cold. She says she recognized the new cattle buyer as a man named Cutter, but that is not the name he gave. She says he worked for the bushwhackers during the war, that he was part of the Quantrill raids. He used to come to her master's plantation to recruit men for special work across the border. She says he is not here for cattle. She says the marshal in Fort Smith, the one who does not like us, knows he is here. I fear that we have become part of something larger than a dispute over land. I fear, perhaps, that we are not safe. The marshal in Fort Smith Briggs refers to was not Isaac Parker. Parker had not yet been appointed. The marshal at that time was a man named William F. Jackson, a former Confederate officer who had been appointed under the Grant administration as a compromise with the southern states. Jackson was known to be hostile to the freedmen's schools, and there were rumors that he had been complicit in the murder of a bureau agent in Texas 2 years earlier. Sarah Dalton believed Jackson had come to Scullyville to meet with Cross, to discuss a plan that would clear the land of the freedmen and the Choctaw, to make way for white settlement. The plan involved a document, a land claim, forged, that would show that the freedmen's school was built on land that had been granted to a Confederate veteran in a treaty that had since been invalidated. The plan also involved a killing. #4. On the night of October 12, 1873, someone set fire to the school at Scullyville. The flames were seen for miles, illuminating the sky like a second dawn. By the time the neighbors arrived, the building was reduced to smoking timbers and ash. The fire was not an accident. Oil had been spread along the floorboards, and the windows had been broken from the outside to allow the flames to spread faster. Elijah Briggs was not in the school when it burned. He was in his cabin, a mile away, writing in his journal. But he heard the alarm and ran to the school, arriving in time to see the roof collapse. He was not alone. Sarah Dalton was there, and several of the freedmen, their faces lit by the flames, their expressions shifting from shock to rage to despair. Briggs wrote the next morning, "I cannot believe what I saw. The children, their books, everything we built is gone." Sarah says she saw Cross riding away from the school an hour before the fire. She says he was not alone. She says there were 4 riders, and one of them was the man she called Cutter. "I wrote to the agency today and to the marshal. I will not let this go. If they will not act, I will travel to Fort Smith myself and demand justice." But before Briggs could make good on his threat, Sarah Dalton disappeared. She was last seen walking toward the agency to meet with a clerk who was supposed to have documents relating to the land claim. She never arrived. When Briggs went to the agency, the clerk denied having seen her. Briggs's journal for the following week is a chronicle of desperation. He visited the Choctaw chiefs, who promised to send word to the territorial authorities. He wrote letters to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to the Secretary of the Interior in Washington, to newspapers in St. Louis and Chicago. He spoke to every freedman he knew, asking for information about Sarah's whereabouts. But each question seemed to bring him closer to the silence that precedes a final reckoning. On October 19, 1873, a white man named Joseph Grimes, a farmer from Missouri who had settled in the area, came to Briggs's cabin. Grimes had served in the Union Army, and he had a reputation as an honest man. He told Briggs that he had heard talk in the local saloon that Sarah Dalton had been taken across the border into Arkansas, to a cabin near the town of Alma, where the fugitive overseer had established a base of operations. Grimes offered to take Briggs to the cabin. He said he could find it, that he knew the trails. He warned Briggs that the men they were looking for were dangerous, that they had killed before, that they would not hesitate to kill again. Briggs agreed to go. He wrote one final entry in his journal that night. "I do not know if I will return. I go because I must." Sarah was a friend, a teacher, a mother to these children. "I cannot abandon her as I have been abandoned. If I do not come back, please send this journal to the Bureau. Let them know what happened here. Let them know the names of the men who have done this. If there is justice in this world, they will answer for it." Elijah Briggs was never seen alive again. The journal that would have told his story was buried at Cinder Bluff, along with the remains of 5 other people, and lay undiscovered for 13 years. But the railroad grader's discovery in 1886 was not the end of the mystery, it was the beginning. The bones were removed, the journal was opened, and the investigation that followed would uncover not just a single crime, but a conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in the territory. The first to examine the journal was a deputy marshal named Ezra C. Johnson, a man who had a reputation for integrity in a profession not known for it. Johnson had been appointed by Judge Parker, who had taken the bench in 1875 and had immediately begun an aggressive campaign against the outlaws who terrorized the Indian Territory. Johnson read the journal in his office at Fort Smith, turning the water-stained pages carefully, his face growing grimmer with each entry. He had heard stories of the Scullyville School, of a fire and a disappearance, but the details had been buried in bureau files and forgotten. Here, in Briggs's own hand, was the chronicle of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the territorial government. Johnson's first act was to find the survivors. He rode to Scullyville and spoke to the freedmen who still lived there. He found several of Briggs's former students, now grown, who remembered the fire and the disappearance. They told him about Sarah Dalton, about Solomon Cross, about the marshal who had never answered Briggs's letters. Johnson then turned his attention to the land claims that Briggs had written about. He traveled to the Choctaw Agency and asked for the records of the Cutter land grant. The clerks were reluctant to produce them, but Johnson was not a man who could be easily deterred. He found that the land claim was indeed forged, the treaty it referenced had never existed, and the signatures on the document were clearly fabricated. The document had been prepared by a man named Charles F. Carson, a lawyer from St. Louis who had, until recently, been serving as an agent to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Carson had been appointed by a senator from Missouri, a man with financial interests in the territory's timber and mineral rights. Johnson now had a motive. The Freedmen's School was sitting on land that was valuable for timber and coal. Carson and his partners wanted the land, and they were willing to do whatever was necessary to clear it. The conspiracy that Briggs had uncovered was not just about racial hatred, it was about profit. #6. Ezra Johnson was not the only person interested in the Cinder Bluff discovery. The railroad company, which had wanted to keep the find a secret, found itself caught in the crossfire of political pressure. The new governor of the territory, a Grant appointee named Edward P. Smith, had been alerted by a reporter at the Fort Smith Elevator, the local newspaper, who had gotten word of the bones from a grader who had been fired and was not happy about it. The elevator's editor, a man named Samuel W. Peel, published a story on October 27, 1886, that set the town ablaze. The discovery of at least 5 human skeletons on the right-of-way of the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Gulf Railroad near the Choctaw border has raised questions that this newspaper intends to pursue until we have answers. The bodies appear to be those of men and women who were murdered and then buried in a common grave. Witnesses report that the remains show signs of violence, blows from a heavy object consistent with a sledgehammer. The railroad company has refused to comment. We asked the marshal's office, who were these victims, and who killed them? Governor Smith ordered an inquest, which was conducted by a commission of 3 men, a judge, a territorial doctor, and a representative of the Choctaw Nation. The commission examined the remains and the journal, and within 2 weeks, they had reached a shocking conclusion: the victims were not just Sarah Dalton and Elijah Briggs. They were 4 other people who had been associated with the school, another teacher, a freedman who had acted as a guard, and 2 women who had worked as laundresses for the Bureau. All of them had been killed at the same time, probably on or around October 20, 1873. Their bodies had been transported to Cinder Bluff, 10 miles from Scullyville, and buried in a shallow grave. The journal had been placed with them, presumably by someone who wanted the story to be told, or perhaps by someone who wanted to hide evidence of a larger crime. The medical examiner's report was grim. The remains exhibit fractures to the skull and ribs consistent with trauma from a blunt instrument. The wounds were inflicted post-mortem, indicating the victims were already dead when they were dismembered. There are marks on the bones consistent with a large blade. The burial was hasty, and the remains were not arranged with any ritual. We conclude that these individuals were murdered by means of blows to the head and body, and their bodies were then mutilated and buried to conceal the crime. The inquest generated a list of suspects: Solomon Cross, who had been seen at the fire, the man Sarah Dalton recognized as an overseer and Confederate bushwhacker, the Marshal William F. Jackson, and the St. Louis lawyer Charles F. Carson. But as the commission dug deeper, they found that the conspiracy went further than they had imagined. Cross had died 3 years earlier in a brawl in Fort Smith. He had been stabbed by a card cheat and left to bleed in an alley. The overseer had disappeared into the Arkansas hills and was never found. Jackson had been removed from his position in 1875 following an investigation into corruption. He had died of yellow fever in Texas in 1881. And Carson had been disbarred in 1876 and was now living in exile, having fled to Europe to escape creditors. The investigation was stymied by the fact that the central suspects were either dead or beyond reach. But there were still living witnesses to the events of 1873, and some of them were willing to talk. A freedman named Jonas Parker, who had been 18 at the time of the fire, was located in a settlement near Muskogee. Parker had been a student at the school, and he remembered the night of the fire vividly. He told the commission that he had seen Solomon Cross and several other men near the school the night it burned. He had heard them talking about the teacher and the woman who knew too much. Parker also remembered a man who had come to Scullyville a few days before the fire, a stranger with a scarred face and a limp. The man had visited Cross's cabin, and Parker had seen him leaving late at night, carrying a long object wrapped in cloth. "Looked like he was going to kill someone," Parker said. "Looked like he had done it before." The most significant revelation, however, came from a former slave, a woman named Cora McMurphy, who had been an assistant to Sarah Dalton. McMurphy, who was now living in Topeka, Kansas, had read about the discovery in a newspaper and had written to the commission, offering her testimony. McMurphy said that Sarah Dalton had confided in her shortly before the disappearance. Sarah had found a document in the agency office, hidden under a floorboard, that showed the land claim was part of a larger scheme, a scheme to clear the freedmen from the territory entirely. The document listed the names of 27 families that were to be removed by force if necessary. The document was signed by Marshal Jackson and Carson, the St. Louis lawyer, and it included references to soldiers who would be available to do the work. Sarah had copied the names of the soldiers and had hidden the copy in a place she had not disclosed. McMurphy did not know where the copy was, but she said that Sarah had described it as the key to everything. The commission searched Sarah's former cabin, which had been abandoned for years, but found nothing. Despite the evidence, the case against the dead men was never formally closed. The commission's report, delivered to Governor Smith in December 1886, concluded that the murders had been committed by Solomon Cross, an unknown companion, and an unspecified number of co-conspirators, and that the motive was the elimination of persons who had knowledge of a scheme to defraud the Choctaw Nation of its lands. But the commission also noted, in a damning final paragraph, the complicity of certain officials of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and of the Deputy Marshal's Office cannot be ruled out. The failure of these officials to investigate the disappearance of Mr. Briggs and Mrs. Dalton in 1873 was not merely negligent, it was willful. We recommend that the Bureau investigate the conduct of those officials and take appropriate action. The Bureau did not act. The report was filed, and the case was set aside. The families of the victims were never compensated. The land claims that had been the cause of the murders were eventually declared invalid, but only after the timber and coal had been extracted by the very men who had sought to profit from the crime. The bones found at Cinder Bluff were buried in a single grave at the Scullyville Cemetery, the same cemetery where the freedmen and the Choctaw had buried their dead for decades. A simple stone was erected, with the names of the 5 known victims: Elijah Briggs, Sarah Dalton, and 3 others whose names were never recovered. The journal was placed in the archives of the Fort Smith National Historic Site, where it remains to this day. Visitors can see it, carefully preserved, its pages still stained with water and earth. The journal's final entry, written on October 19, 1873, is displayed in a glass case, the handwriting barely visible, the words a desperate plea from a man who knew he would not survive the night. The story of Elijah Briggs and the Cinder Bluff murders is not a famous story. It is not a story you will find in the textbooks, or in the standard histories of the American West. It is a story that was deliberately buried, first in a shallow grave in Choctaw territory, and then in the archives of a government that preferred to forget. But the story did not stay buried. The railroad graders who found the bones could not have known that they were uncovering evidence of a crime that would implicate a senator, a marshal, a lawyer, and a network of men who had murdered for profit. They could not have known that the journal they found would lead to an investigation that exposed a conspiracy that had been hidden for 13 years. And yet, even now, there are questions that cannot be answered. What did the document contain that made it necessary to kill 6 people? Where is the copy Sarah Dalton made, and did she hide it in the school, or in the cabin that was never searched, or in the hands of someone who still carries its secret? And why did the government do nothing, when the evidence was so clear? The story of Cinder Bluff is a story of justice delayed and justice denied. It is a story of a forgotten corner of American history, where the law was bought and sold, and the dead had no voice. But the dead do have a voice, if we are willing to listen. The bones beneath the limestone are not the only evidence. The journal is not the only witness. The truth is still out there, buried in some forgotten file, in the archives of a government that has long since moved on. And perhaps, one day, someone will find it. But for now, the question remains. What else was buried at Cinder Bluff, and who still wants it to stay hidden?